building. We do look like a couple of news presenters, we decided.
We do, yeah, especially if it's this angle, yeah. But so we're here to talk about, we've done a podcast before, haven't we?
Yep.
It was a combination of post office scandal and Lucy Letby, and I think it was in the autumn last year, and quite a lot's happened.
Pre-Christmas, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Not so much on the post office issue, but a lot's happened on the Lucy Letby matter.
Yeah, post office is I mean, let's not talk any more about that because I don't think there's very much to discuss really at the moment. It's all just waiting for a report. Suffice to say that the SRA seem to be getting the bit between their teeth now and investigating a number of firms and individuals, which is all great news from the point of view of straightforward and honest lawyers. But anyway, but Letby is kind of the key thing we wanted to chat about today, isn't it?
Yeah. So Letby, what's happened? I've identified five sort of developments. So the main thing is, of course, we've had these experts come forward. I think this has been arranged by the new counsel,
McDonald,
Mark McDonald. Yeah. So he's done the right thing, because what he's done is he's gone abroad and he's found some experts that are at the absolute top of their game.
Yep.
And no one can possibly question their medical expertise in this area. These are the specialists.
These are the
neonatologists. And he's had to go abroad because they're not under the same pressures. Here, there may be stigma attached to giving evidence against the NHS or against the system, as it were. Whereas if you go abroad, people can speak a little bit more freely. Without the concern. So what have they actually come up with? I don't know if you've been following the story, but basically it's 14 medical experts led by a retired Canadian neonatologist called Dr. Shu Lee. And he's the one that chaired that press conference, and there were a number of experts behind them. And importantly, I understand that he agreed to publish his findings regardless of whether or not it was in favour of Lucy or not. That was one of the key criteria.
Yes.
And I think McDonald arranged it that way because it had extra credibility if that was the case.
Yeah,
and he's doing it completely pro bono.
Yep.
He's not being paid for it. Yep. There's no incentive whatsoever. Yep. So he's come forward. So these experts have presented findings, and they've basically found, in summary, that there is no medical evidence to support Lucy Letby's convictions for murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 7 others. The panel attributed the infant's death to natural causes and medical errors rather than deliberate harm. And Dr. Lee criticised the prosecution's expert, maybe going a little bit further than his medical remit, but he criticised the prosecution's expert for misinterpreting findings on embolism, and Letby's defence lawyer is now seeking a case review. So let's be clear where this is going. This has been arranged to support a renewed application to the CCRC, which is the Criminal Cases Review Commission, which we can talk about shortly. So I've got the details of those cases and those findings, if we can just quickly summarise them, because it's quite, the detail is relatively important. So what we've got is they've discussed three children, I think. So child 1, originally it was alleged that the infant died from air embolism caused by the injection of air into the intravenous line. The panel concluded the infant's death resulted from thrombosis due to a delayed infusion start, leading to clot development, with no evidence supporting the presence of an air embolism. So that's quite important. And number 2, child 4, the prosecution claimed this infant died from air embolism. However, the panel found that the cause of death was sepsis, pneumonia, and disseminated intravascular coagulation, with no evidence supporting the presence of air embolism. So child 9, it was alleged that air was injected to this infant's stomach via a nasogastric tube, leading to respiratory arrest and failure. The panel determined that the infant died due to complications from respiratory distress syndrome and chronic lung disease. They noted the medical staff failed to respond to routine surveillance warnings and did not recognise the diagnosis and did not administer proper antibiotics. And lastly, in fact, this is 2 children, F and L, insulin poisoning allegation. So the prosecution argued these infants were poisoned with insulin, citing specific insulin and C-peptide levels of evidence. The panel found that the insulin and C-peptide levels were typical for babies of their age and that the tests used were not of forensic quality.
Yeah, so there's a number of components to that, or commonalities, which is the air issue, the air intake issue, the sepsis issue, and the insulin issue, which are the kind of three live components of concern in the medical evidence. I mean, it's true that Evans, the prosecution expert, said that, I think he said to the jury that it was clinically proven that babies died from the air intake tube issue. And this apparently is not right. This is only our opinion, of course, but this is not on the sepsis point. Chester Hospital was the fifth worst performing hospital on those issues at the material time. And I think I was reading that 9 out of the 17 babies had confirmed sepsis. So, those things go hand in hand. You can't then attribute the sepsis to one single person, it seems to me, in circumstances in which the whole hospital is performing so terribly badly.
And I think in one case, didn't the baby had the tube rather down the air duct, it was down the esophagus.
Oh yeah, they were saying about the misplacement.
The misplacement, yeah. And that was one where I believe Lucy was accused of standing by and not taking any action on the baby, whereas in fact the tube was actually in the wrong.
Well, that was the evidence of this this consultant, wasn't it? What's his name? This guy, Jairam.
Yeah, Jairam. Yeah, so he was one of the key witnesses.
The critical component there is, of course, that he was. A lot of people are forgetting, and again, the jury didn't know about this grievance issue that Letby had raised in the hospital. And as I understand it, Jairam was one of the people that she'd complained about. So, we talk about looking for motive. I mean, nobody can really see any motive for Letby's alleged behaviour. That seems to be completely missing. Then you look at the corollary there. So Jairam's motive, perhaps, for having a go at Letby is evident from the complaint that perhaps she made.
She made against him, and there's at least one baby where he's in the frame himself.
Exactly. So, and the insulin point, which is the third point that you'd raised, I can't remember the exact detail of this, but it is said, I think, by these experts that the insulin administration to bring about the death by that reason would have had to be 80 times above the insulin component that the prosecution alleged. And the insulin that was available in the hospital didn't show there wasn't enough of it there.
There wasn't enough of it there, yeah. That was quite incredible. I think one important point to make is that from sort of a layperson's perspective, looking at all this, one would think, wouldn't one, that, well, if there are this many doubts, then the whole thing needs to be looked at. But that's not the way the legal system actually works. And there was, some people say that Letby has had her appeal and it was turned down. In fact, that's technically not quite right. She applied for permission to appeal and was refused permission. That is allied to the chances of appeal, but she hasn't actually had
an appeal.
Full-blown appeal. Correct. But what the appeal judge did say in previously dismissing her application for permission to appeal is that it didn't matter exactly how she administered the death. All the jury had to be satisfied was that she caused, or she intended to cause serious harm to the babies, and that was enough. And that's a slightly different way of looking at it, isn't it? Because even if, I think that's what the prosecution is saying, is even though we can't prove necessarily precisely which method she used, we say that on the balance, well, not on the balance probably, to beyond all reasonable doubt that she committed these murders.
Some interesting bit about the her being on duty and the door data that was used. That's kind of an interesting element because there's the door data. It seems to me is incorrect. There are a lot of omissions that were through a door that didn't keep data. It was just a key system. It didn't have any data support.
And then wasn't there a back door that everyone used anyway?
So the data in relation to her being in certain places at certain times was massively misleading.
And apparently the prosecution knew about that flaw in the evidence before the trial and still.
This raises important comparisons with the post office case, doesn't it? Is prosecutors have a real responsibility. to make sure that they are presenting cases fairly. And where prosecutors fail to do that, it seems to me that defendants have very little opportunity to challenge. They don't know what the areas of challenge are because they're being slammed with this evidence, which is, necessarily biased. And juries, of course, they can only make judgments on the evidence that they see. And if the evidence that's presented by the prosecution is flawed in that way, are weighted in favour of a successful prosecution, then the jury is being hoodwinked in these trials. And this is what happened in the post office. I mean, you have to question the validity of the judicial system in those circumstances to test that.
I think it's highlighted a particular sort of flaw in the system. I mean, people might be surprised to hear that, in fact, there were only 10 jurors who reached their verdict. And in some of the charges, I think two of them they found unanimously, but two they found only by majority. And the minimum that's required is 9 jurors. I think 2 were discharged for undisclosed reasons.
So you have to ask yourself, had there been 12 jurors,
would it have been different? Legally speaking, that's fine, because that's allowed. So let's look at the political reaction to this. So we know that David Davis MP has been very vocal on this. Wes Streeting, who's the current health secretary, he has said, maybe slightly predictably, that until a court has ordered otherwise, he's going to treat that conviction as completely fair and safe. And he went further than that by describing that those that are campaigning to argue that this is a miscarriage of justice need to have more respect for the victims. I can understand from a politician's point of view why he's put that forward, but I don't think I really accept that. Well, I mean, one wouldn't expect him to come forward in the same way as David Davis, because obviously he's a serving member of the cabinet, but he could at least perhaps say, maybe the inquiry needs to be paused while the latest CR...
The loss of a baby, I mean, you've got kids, I've got kids, I mean... The loss of a child in any circumstances is tragic and awful, and difficult to conceive how that plays out in a family setting or to the individuals, the parents, and so on. I mean, of course, but if you've got an unsafe conviction hanging over someone, that is also someone's life. And for me, these convictions must be subject to scrutiny, because it's only by scrutinising that we can find these things that are under stones that need to be discovered. I mean, the Malkinson thing, 17 years in prison for a rape he didn't commit. There are so many other cases. I mean, for me, I mean, I'm a great advocate actually of bringing back the death penalty. That's one of my things. But for me, the question here is, would I feel comfortable about Letby going on the end of a rope? I'm not. I think there's so many questions around it that wouldn't feel like the right way to go. And I think where that uncertainty is there in your gut, that for me is the test. And there seem to be so many aspects to this case which feel wrong.
Exactly that. There's not just one. If it was just one, then one could maybe...
There are so many components to it that are very uncomfortable. And of course, it's an uncomfortable conversation in the public domain, because naturally the focus is on the victims and the children, and that's of course where our natural empathy starts. But equally, there must be empathy for a family if there is an incorrect conviction, and this can't be right. And presumably the families, even though they've had to face this terrible trauma, and it is a terrible trauma, would also not want to see someone convicted of a crime that they didn't actually commit.
Well, surely they'd want the truth, wouldn't they?
They would want the truth. And I think, I mean, that brings us perhaps to the inquiry.
Yeah, because I mean, I think a lot of people are saying that whilst there's this application that Mark McDonald has done into the CRCC, whilst that's still in process, and whilst there's a possibility of that finding in favour of Lucy Letby, the inquiry should be suspended. Because otherwise it's a complete waste of taxpayers' money. Because if Lucy Letby isn't the cause of these deaths, then it looks likely that it's something to do with the medical care. And if that's the case, that puts a completely different perspective on the inquiry, and different things need to be done.
Yeah. And that inquiry is not looking at any of the, I mean, the things about the sepsis, about the insulin, about the air tube. The inquiry is not looking at any of the facts that the jury didn't have. So it's not really a proper examination. And I think the head of the inquiry has said, I'm not concerned with any arguments about the convictions. We've got the convictions, and that's where we are. And this is why we're looking at this, and this in the course of this inquiry. But I agree with you. I think the value of the inquiry is lost. It seems to me at this.
I think there's a real danger of it being a waste of.
And the cost
money.
Of it is
enormous. Absolutely enormous. I wanted to go on to the legal side of the legal test. Now, we've mentioned about the Court of Appeal and the permission.
Yeah.
So the CCRC test for referral is actually, this is why a lot of people think even with this new panel coming forward, there's a real chance that it will fail at the CCRC. It just depends on which way they take it, because they could be under political pressure to send it back to the Court of Appeal. But just to look at the test, the CCRC doesn't have the power to quash the conviction.
Yeah.
They can only send it back to the Court of Appeal. Mm-hmm. So we're still stuck with the Court of Appeal rules on appeals. So the test for the CCRC is that there must be a real possibility that the conviction, verdict or sentence would not be upheld if referred. And there has to be a real new evidence or argument has emerged that was not raised during the trial.
Well,
first appeal. So that rules out some of the things that she's put in the first appeal. And that it must undermine the safety of the conviction. And finally, it may determine that there are exceptional circumstances to justify a review, even if the applicant has already had an appeal, which I suppose Mark McDonald would be relying on that ground. Now, the difficulty will be this test of the real possibility. So in a way, it's kind of self-defeating, because the CCRC test is mirrored to the test that the Court of Appeal would apply. And so all of the problems with the Court of Appeal test bring themselves over to the CCRC. One can only hope that they will examine ground 3 under the exceptional circumstances and decide perhaps the political weight is so strong that they ought to refer it to the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal then have their own test, so they will only quash a conviction if the conviction is unsafe, i.e. a significant legal, evidential or procedural issue makes it unjust, and fresh evidence is available that was not presented at trial, is credible and relevant, and could have affected the jury's verdict. So the key difference is that the CCRC's role is to decide whether a case should be reviewed by the Court of Appeal, while the Court of Appeal makes the final decision on when the conviction is unsafe. So in Lucy Letby's case, her legal team will likely argue that the new expert opinion evidence they have amounts to fresh evidence that was not properly considered during the trial, giving rise to the real possibility of a successful appeal. But the CCRC has to accept this, and the biggest hurdle that her legal team have is that this evidence that's come forward, it's difficult to see how that couldn't have been made available at the original trial. And we just don't know why her legal team did not.
We've had this conversation a couple of times, haven't we? What were they doing? Were the defence team so confident that the prosecution evidence was so weak that the conviction could never have arisen in the first place? I mean, were they resting on their laurels, so to speak?
Well, we don't know is the answer. There's a number of possibilities.
Or were her legal team directed by her, in some way or another, to not call evidence of a certain
it's difficult to apply hindsight, isn't it?
Because we don't know.
Because it's the prosecution's job to prove the case, and it may be that the defence team felt that their best chance
was to sit back and let them do it.
Because the evidence didn't back up. It was all probability based.
But it seems to me that there are a whole catalogue of things now. If you had a little, I was thinking, when you're doing lists of pluses and minuses, good things and bad things and issues. I mean, there is an increasingly long list of concerns about these convictions. And however that sits in the minds of the public, it's also sitting in the minds of the Letby family and Letby in particular. That there's this whole list of things that are very concerning, and rather less in this list on the other side showing that things should remain as they are today, because I don't feel that that's right. There must be a proper re-examination of all of this.
I think it's a re-examination that people are asking for. People aren't asking for her to be immediately released or their conviction quashed. All they're saying is, can somebody take another look at this?
But people are very careful to say, well, I'm not saying whether she's guilty or she's not guilty. The question is, have the prosecution done enough to make her guilty?
To prove her
and for me, there's sufficient question marks around a lot of this evidence presented to the jury, and maybe a lot of evidence that wasn't ever presented, or was never in the domain for consideration by either side at the time. Particularly this panel of experts who've produced its very detailed report.
That's the reality. And of course, there is this case in Holland. I think she's his name's similar to Lucy, Lucinda or something. But she's very similar facts to this, and that was also a miscarriage of justice, and it was also based on probability evidence being put forward. It doesn't just happen in this jurisdiction.
And then, of course, we've got timing, because these things take so long. I mean, I think again,
there's a backlog with the CCRC.
Thousand cases. Yeah. I mean, it's there are a lot of other cases, of course, which are of equal importance.
And there's no real reason why this should go to the top of the list.
Well, indeed.
And it can take sometimes 10 years. 10 years or so to get released. So no, that's okay. If that happens, she'd receive compensation. But then, if your life is ruined, what good is compensation?
So, dear watchers, we will be back over the course of the next 10 years.
But we'll see what the CCRC say, because that would be the interesting point. I don't know when they're going to publish their decision. I know the application's gone in, but we'll have to watch the space. But it's all very interesting to see how this test gets applied. And she's obviously not going to get any help whatsoever from Parliament, giving the comments from West Streeting. Yeah. So she's just simply in the hands of the CCRC, and that's her.
Well, that's how it should be. In fairness, I mean, it should be a proper test. Outside of political pressure, that must be right. Anyway, we'll be back again, I suppose, on the post office scandal report, which should be out in the summertime, I think, sometime.
Oh, that'll be interesting.
So, in the meantime, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.
Good night.
Thanks, bye.